Red Bull has fired a warning shot to rivals expecting to challenge it as F1's top dog in 2024. The short version is, don't count on it. There are plenty of teams who could theoretically challenge Red Bull. Will Ferrari finally crack it? Can Mercedes get back to its best? Might McLaren's stellar progress carry over into another big step? Could Aston Martin regain its early season momentum? Or is it going to be Alpine? No, we've gone too far there. But the point is, they all expect a big step forward in 2024 thanks to changes to car concepts and redesigns that eliminate limitations they are stuck with right now. It's a time of hope for them, hope that Red Bull has poured buckets of cold water on. While Red Bull's rivals have jostled for position behind, Max Verstappen and the RB19 have dominated, and that gives Red Bull the luxury of ensuring that next year's car has the potential to move the goalposts dramatically. Red Bull team principal Christian Horner has issued a stark warning. He says Red Bull has added little performance since the summer break. That's because Red Bull has focused on development work on the RB20 in a bid to counteract the aerodynamic testing restrictions it's working under. That's not to say there has been zero development on the 2023 car, and we'll delve into its evolution shortly, but it is consistent with what the team has been saying all year. As Horner said in Hungary shortly before the mid-season break, we really have to swing our focus over to next year, which followed a half-season in which Red Bull was already sinking decent resources into 2024. And this is crucial given Red Bull has been on the back foot for the past 12 months in terms of the aerodynamic development it is permitted thanks to a combination of the rules and a past misdemeanour. Red Bull has had the disadvantage of less aerodynamic testing time than its rivals thanks to being top of the ATR charts, that's F1's aerodynamic testing regulations. This mechanism awards greater wind tunnel runs and CFD items to those who are ranked lower in the Constructors' Championship. That's calculated by taking the nominal 100% figure for aerodynamic testing, which is given to the 7th place team, rising or falling in 5 percentage point increments for the other teams. This is reset twice a year, once based on the season end standings and once based on the end of July. This means Red Bull has had 70% of the maximum in 2023. But there's more. Red Bull also had an additional 10% reduction in its aerodynamic testing as punishment for its 2021 cost cap breach. That penalty was applied in late October 22, so has only just run out. Red Bull has therefore decided to allocate its aerodynamic testing to the advantage of its 2024 car. That's because its pace during 2023 has been strong enough that it avoided the tough decision of having to invest more into this year's car at the expense of next year's. That's a kick in the teeth for the chasing pack. Mercedes and Ferrari in particular needed to put pressure on Red Bull in the first half of the year to force it into some tough decisions on what to prioritise. They, and the rest, failed to do so. And that could cost them big time next year. Red Bull had a significant advantage this year in race trim in particular. In terms of single lap pace, Red Bull has usually had the quickest car, with its advantage ballooning come the race itself. But what makes its position so strong is that there has been no consistent rival. At times, Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin, McLaren and even Haas have been the strongest non-Red Bull in qualifying or the race. Tally up those, and it's clear there's a pattern of there being no consistent challenger. Ferrari has most often been the biggest threat, but in the second half of the season, McLaren has emerged as the second best team. So not only has Red Bull had a clear advantage, but not one of these teams has really emerged as its biggest long-term threat. And that's also partly because while Red Bull has been cautious on development, it hasn't stood still. So is Horner telling the truth when he says Red Bull has been light on development? Let's take a look at the evolution of the RB19. Red Bull's first major development step in the first half of the season came in Baku at the end of April. There it introduced a modified floor and new side pod inlet shape. This followed the introduction of a modified front wing at the previous race in Australia 4 weeks earlier. There were further floor tweaks in Spain in early June. This was followed by a new front wing in Canada a fortnight later and modified rear suspension fairings in Austria another 2 weeks on. But the second major step was in Hungary in late July, where there was another floor step and another upgrade that modified the side pod inlet shape again. The side pod inlet modifications conferred an aerodynamic advantage, but developing this design was good value in terms of aerodynamic testing, as there is allowance for that related to cooling that falls outside of the ATR. However, that wouldn't apply to the whole package, just some detail work where the bodywork met the cooling apparatus. But hey, every little helps. Since the summer break, there has been little new, with upgrades restricted to a few circuit-specific tweaks as well as a new beam wing at Zandvoort and tweaked floor edges and rear wing end plate in Singapore. Across the most recent 4 weekends in Japan, Qatar, the USA and Mexico, the only change was additional cooling moves to deal with the conditions in Mexico City. So Red Bull has made gains, albeit ones that have levelled off since the break. It also has the best interaction of the mechanical platform and the aerodynamic characteristics of any team, something that can be traced back to Adrian Newey designing the front and rear suspension of last year's car that the RB19 is an evolution of. Development, of course, is a relative game, and this has been enough to ensure Red Bull has stayed on top. Interestingly, F1's own analysis of development rates broadcast during the Mexican Grand Prix weekend suggested Ferrari has actually lost 0.14 seconds in terms of average pace compared to Red Bull across 2022. As for Mercedes, it has only gained 9 thousandths of a second. And remember, Red Bull has stayed ahead despite rivals getting a clear view of its underfloor at Monaco after Sergio Perez crashed. But as Red Bull chief engineer Paul Monahan said at the time, he didn't expect it to be until late in the season that rivals could produce their own versions inspired by what they've learned. He suggested maybe around the Japanese Grand Prix. As he put it, if that led rivals to change their development plan, that would increase the phase lag for them getting new parts to the car. And, of course, in Japan, Red Bull was still ahead, because while everyone else was working out what to do, it was cracking on with developing its 2023 and 2024 cars. So which team has showed itself to be best placed to take on Red Bull? Well, arguably all of them, and none of them. Ferrari has most often been its closest challenger. It has edged closer to the Red Bull concept this year with the increase in downwash with its side pods and unseen floor changes. Ferrari has promised what it calls a brand new car with significant architectural changes that will unlock more performance. As chassis boss Enrico Cardile put it, Ferrari realised this year it made some wrong architectural choices with this car. I asked Charles Leclerc whether he thought Ferrari is headed in the right direction given the improved consistency of the car in terms of handling this year. And he said, "The work we've done in the second part of the season confirmed it is the direction to go." Mercedes is another team that has promised architectural changes. This builds on the recent progress made in adding rear downforce and a car that's now much more to Lewis Hamilton's liking. Team principal Toto Wolff said that without cost cap constraints, Mercedes would have introduced a new monocoque this season to allow such changes. Instead, that waits for next year. Then there's McLaren, the strongest performer over the second half of the season. It studied the Red Bull closely after the Monaco floor revelation and has learned some lessons that have contributed to development. There's also hope it can sort the knife-edge handling of the car and improve its slow corner weakness. Combined with its magnificent fast corner performance, that could make a formidable package. As for Aston Martin, it can't be counted out but needs to make a big step over the winter. But then again, it did that last time. However, they are all aiming for a moving target, so while they will all make gains and potentially have a car as good as this year's Red Bull, the RB20 could change the game. It's always said that performance converges when rules are stable, and 2024 is year 3 of these regulations, but while that rule of thumb is true, there's still plenty more to be found in terms of performance for Red Bull. The question is, how? Heading into 2023, it took a leap forward thanks to a step in suspension geometry at the rear in particular that improved the mechanical platform. Others will follow that and match Red Bull for anti-dive at the front and anti-squat at the rear, but what might Adrian Newey have conjured up in the meantime? The one limitation was the research and development time aerodynamically, but Red Bull has been able to make the most of that by effectively not overdoing it on the RB19. Horner is adamant the limitations will have had a negative impact on the 2024 car as well. As he puts it, you've not seen the full impact yet because it has compromised development. But there's nothing to suggest it's compromised it enough to help out the rest. Red Bull has dominated the last 2 years because it has the best car, and it has the best car because it has the deepest understanding of these ground effect regulations. That likely won't change next year. It could be caught in 2024, but the failure of rivals to put it under pressure, making life easier for Red Bull, will likely show when the new car hits the track next February.